Hello everybody, it's me again, this time with a review of Panzergruppe Guderian, the Avalon Hill version of an earlier SPI title. This one was printed in 1976. I have played it both on Vassal and the actual board game. Just a brief overview. The game is set in 1941. In June and subsequent months, and during this time the German Wehrmacht sent its panzers under Guderian, der Schnelle Heinz as he was also called, to fight in the Soviet Union and to get as far east as possible. It was the Operation Barbarossa, and the idea is to, in this game, to actually get to Smolensk and beyond if possible. The game operates based on a victory point principle. So basically at the beginning of the game there are no victory points in the hands of the Germans, and they can get victory points during the game by occupying Russian, or by actually, well, not necessarily occupying, but winning Russian cities from the Soviet player. And they don't need to station troops, so they can also just basically wipe out all of the Soviet troops in the city if the Soviet player has deployed them there, and then move on. They don't need to have troops there, but obviously if you don't have any troops there, then the Russian player can come in again and he can reoccupy them, and then you would lose your victory points. The other way the German player can win victory points is if the Russian player brings in extraordinary reinforcements. He can bring in 10 units over the course of the game, and if he brings them in from the southern front, then the German player also gets victory points. The game is played over 12 turns, and it starts with the Russian player deploying his troops first and then making his moves, and only then will the German player start bringing in forces himself. The Russian player has no control, or not only no control, but he has no knowledge of the kind of troops he's going to bring in. There is a fog of war principle in place by which the Russian player knows which general he's going to bring in, and also what type of unit. So is it armored or is it infantry? But then he pulls blindly from a pile of infantry or armored troops, and then he puts them down face down, so that neither the Russian player nor the German player knows how strong or weak any given stack from the Russian player is. The German player has no fog of war. The deployment is also fixed. And it follows the historical deployment of troops during the Operation Barbarossa, and they come in every game in the same order, because somebody asked me, is there a change in deployment from game to game? Is there any randomization for the German player? There isn't. It's always fixed, and what can happen is also that some of the Russian units are zero units. They are either unable to attack, so if you attack with the Russian stack and you turn over the chits and you realize that one of them is a zero attack value unit, you have to remove that unit immediately, or they have zero defense. If you're attacking as a German player a Russian stack and you switch over the chits and you find one of those zero defense units, then they get eliminated straight away as well. So as a German player, you can be very, very lucky in that you run into a stack and you attack them, you don't know what you're attacking, and it turns out that 2 out of 3 units are eliminated immediately. So it's going to be easy prey for you. Or as a Russian player, you can try and attack a German stack, and then you realize, well, 1 or 2 or maybe even 3, if you're really unlucky, of your units are zero value and there is no combat, or you're going to lose very, very easily. Zones of control are sticky in this game, which means that once you enter the zone of control of an enemy stack, movement ends, and you cannot leave this zone of control voluntarily. Voluntarily means you cannot just say, oh, I'm going to expend movement points, I'm just going to move on, but unless you enter into combat, you cannot leave. And usually what happens when you enter into combat is you either win, in which case you advance after combat, and then of course there is no enemy zone of control anymore, and you're free to move on unless the enemy has brought in other troops that have now started to encircle you in an enemy zone of control. Or you enter into combat, you lose, you get to a result that is a loss, and you can either choose sometimes if you take a step loss or if you want to retreat. And sometimes that is a very good option. And I'm going to tell you why. Because the Russian player really is always at a disadvantage because his stacks can be sometimes almost empty. So the Russian player really needs to make sure that the German player gets no or very, very few victory points, and essentially needs to hold out for 12 rounds. So once the 12th turn has been played, you just tally up the victory points. So one way of trying to make sure that the German player gets hardly any victory points is for the Russian player to deploy his troops so that they take all of the victory point hexes, and then he's ensconced in those cities, and actually attacking somebody who's ensconced in a city is quite difficult. It took me several turns to vacate 2 of the city spaces on the very western part of the board. So that was a very, very laborious process, which engaged several stacks because the Russian stacks were very, very powerful, number one, so that's pure luck, but also because of course their defense value is doubled, and they were all in supply, so that means that they're quite difficult to eliminate. And the issue was that, of course, it took me quite a lot of time and a lot of stacks, German stacks, to get rid of the Russians. And it meant that I could also not advance as quickly to the east as I wanted to. And of course, you're trying to get to Smolensk, so there is a lot of territory you need to cover. And so for the Russian player, it's really important to just basically throw themselves into the path of the German advance and just bind them and pin them in place. You see where they are because they're moving across the board, and then you try and throw your own stacks, even weak stacks, at them, because you throw yourself at this German stack, but you don't really have to fight them. You can just pin them in place and then wait for the next turn for the Germans to fight you, because otherwise they will not be able to advance. So that is actually quite a good tactic that I found. And it's quite an entertaining game. Overall, this was my first non-ancients war game that I played on a board, and that wasn't a block game. And I really, really like it. I think it's a great game. Somebody said when they looked at the counters, oh, those are vintage counters. That's true. But I have to say, I don't mind them. I mean, this game is, what now, almost 40 years old at this stage, 37 years old. I really like the map. The map is mounted, which is not a prerequisite for me. I don't really need mounted maps, but it's really beautifully drawn and I really like it. There's not much detail. It's mainly, white hexes and then some forests and some, roads and stuff. But I really like it. It's very easy to read. It's very easy to play on it. And I would also say that the rule set is astounding in its simplicity. And I'm not saying that it's a simple game. I'm not saying that the game is easy. I'm not saying that I didn't make any mistakes. Yes, I did make mistakes. I had to reset. But the way the rules are written is very simple, very clear. They're really outlining what you need to do. Very few words. I think it's 12 pages in all. And everything is covered. So, what else was I going to say? Yeah, it's not a tactical game, it's a strategic game. It's not an operational game either, so basically it's really strategic. but it's not as operational as maybe the OCS series. One thing is really interesting, and that was something that I found was a very interesting addition, because it's a kind of rule that in my tactical games that I would have played, Ancients doesn't really enter into it. That is the idea of supply, being in and out of supply. The Russians basically bring their supply line with them by having leaders, generals, who then only have to trace a direct line to the eastern board, which was very easy because the Germans just never made it far enough to the east to cut off supply, and they also couldn't have air interdiction too far to the east because they hadn't captured Smolensk yet, so there was a limit as to how far to the east they can put their air interdiction markers. German supply was more difficult to coordinate, and I found myself out of supply more than once, by chance. It wasn't that the Russian player, that I as a Russian player had done anything to make myself unavailable, to make myself run out of supply. But it is a very interesting concept, of course, because it means that your movement is halved and your combat values are halved too. And it's a really it's something to watch out for. Determining whether Germans are in supply, I tried it on Vassal and I thought it was really difficult, but the reason is you can't see the whole map. When you play it on the board, it's very easy because you have two ways to determine supply. Either you're within 20 hexes of a road that leads to the exit hex on the west, on the western edge, or you have to be 20 movement points away from the western edge, and there must not be any either interdiction markers or enemy units in your path. And once a panzer unit has moved 3 times, that's 30 movement points that they can expend. It's impossible to trace it's almost impossible to trace a direct line that is 20 movement points to your western edge. And then, of course, everybody was very quickly out of supply because the Russians held 2 cities which the Germans were unable to dislodge them from. And these 2 cities are actually on the main road that leads you to the western edge. And so they were all out of supply, which made it quite difficult for them to do much because then they were really weakened. So in the end, the Germans managed to get 25 victory points, which is a marginal, I think, Russian victory. The Russians didn't bring in any additional reinforcements, any unplanned reinforcements, and I have to say that this game is very intriguing to me. It's one of those games where you sit, or where I was sitting, for example, in my car at the traffic lights and thinking about the game, thinking about, okay, so what would I need to do to win? What should I do next? What is my next move? It kept me thinking about it, and it kept me preoccupied, which I think is a very good sign because it means that the game is really engaging for me. So I can recommend this game, especially if you've never played a war game before and you're interested in the modern era, so 20th century, Second World War. I can recommend it because the number of counters is really light. I mean, you have stacks of 4 counters max, and one of them would then be a Russian leader. So you have max 3 counters in a stack, and there are hardly any information counters, so counter density is really low. Like I said, the rules are extremely well written. It's a game that has a lot of depth that you want to go back to and revisit and try other strategies and play over and over again. And it's easy to set up and it's easy to play in terms of you get into it really quickly, although you will make mistakes, but that's fine. The only thing that I think is probably going to be a little bit difficult is getting a hold of it, because I think it's been out of print probably for 30 years at this stage. But you can still get it secondhand. I got my copy secondhand as well. So if you can get a hold of this, get it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Bye.